Now, we've talked earlier already about there are certain arguments that don't appeal to the mainstream, and keeping the law as it is all about winning the middle ground. Those people who aren't with us ideologically, but nonetheless will be persuaded by certain arguments. And the arguments that we'll look at the arguments from the other side and the arguments that work best. So now we normally hear these arguments personified. So this is Tony Nicholson, who had locked-in syndrome and could not talk apart from through a computer, and took a case to the Supreme Court. So you can see there his quote, "My life is dull, miserable, demeaning, undignified and intolerable. I should be able to decide how and when I end it." So it's all about personal choice or autonomy. Carey, the current law fails to address the fundamental question of why we should force terminally ill patients to go on in unbearable pain. Desmond Tutu, I think when you need machines to help you breathe, you have to ask questions about the quality of life being experienced and about the way money is being spent. Now, I think he was also influenced by the Mandela case. But, of course, there are lots of people who have machines to help them breathe. I've got two very good friends who every night hook up to a CPAP machine. And both of them are international conference speakers, and you would know their names if I told you what they were. So, you know, there's a lot of misunderstanding in the general public. Mary Warnock was the one who was the originator of the Warnock Report on embryo research, which gave rise to the Human Fertilization and Embryology Act. And this is her comment: if you're demented, you're wasting people's lives, your family's lives, and you're wasting the resources of the National Health Service. And she lost her husband, who had dementia, and she was very much influenced by that experience. But there's a lot of people who feel this, and so there we are. The arguments are usually personified in people, but there are basically three arguments for assisted suicide and euthanasia, and they are these ones: autonomy, compassion, and economics. And so if we look at those, first the compassion argument. And in terms of how you address this, the first thing is to say, well, are the symptoms actually untreatable? Because in good hands, virtually all pain can be either relieved or substantially alleviated. And pain is only very, very rarely given as a reason for assisted suicide. In Oregon, it's less than 30% who say that they either have pain or are afraid of pain in the future, and that the two are not divided, so we don't know how many have real pain. But consultants in palliative medicine will tell you that in good hands you can do it. Have all the referral avenues been sought? And I mentioned right at the beginning of the day the Nigel Sykes case. Remember the rheumatologist who killed the lady with rheumatoid arthritis? And they said at his judgment that he'd failed by not referring. And in fact, in the British Medical Journal, shortly after this case occurred, there were a whole series of letters from pain specialists, anaesthetists, intensivists and so on, saying, if I'd had a patient like that, then I would have given them these drugs and so on. So the point is, he was in a desperate situation and he failed to refer and ask for help because he was a specialist who thought he knew everything. Are the symptoms medical? We've already talked about that, existential symptoms. And then the last thing, it's much more about the pain, the patient than the illness. And think of the two people with the two rugby players who broke their neck. So Daniel James, and he's off to Dignitas to kill himself. And then Matt Hampson is running a charity to raise money for people less fortunate than himself. Now, I know Matt's injuries are actually worse than Daniel's. And what that tells you is that this is not about the disease or the condition, it's about the person. And it's about how people value and think about their illness. And you could say that regardless of what the condition is. Autonomy, so the so-called right to die. Of course, you can't have a right without also having a reciprocal duty for a doctor or someone else. many free requests are not freely made. Why? Because people are either overtly coerced by someone with an interest in their deaths, or more commonly than that, there's this internalized sense of duty that I'm being a burden upon others, and that then the decent thing to do is to relieve that burden from those I love. Rights granted to some undermine rights granted to others. So when you change the law, as well as allowing a certain group of people to end their lives, at the same time you're removing legal protection from everybody in that group so that they are then susceptible. And then limits to freedom. We all believe that in a democratic society there are limits to freedom. That's why we have laws. And it's actually those laws that ensure our freedoms. So that the law that I have to drive on the left-hand side of the road, yeah, but it's up here. So actually protects other people, because if we could drive anywhere, of course, so laws are there to protect us, and in particular to protect vulnerable people from exploitation and abuse. And the primary function of government is to protect the weakest citizens from exploitation. And we've looked at the Jacques Vitalia quote already. So there we are: compassion, autonomy, and economics. And I've put up these arguments before. So pressure to request early death, palliative care, and then the current law being the best one we could have. Now, before we look in more detail at the arguments themselves, and there are four of them I want to look at in more detail, we have to be really clear, and I find this is a huge issue when you're speaking on this to Christian audiences and churches, that there's a huge amount of misunderstanding about these three things. Because just as we must define what euthanasia is, we need to be equally carefully to define what it's not. And euthanasia does not include terminating or not initiating a medically useless treatment. We've talked about that before, that when the burden of a treatment outweighs its benefit, then it's good medicine not to give it. And of course the issue there is that the person dies not from something you've done or haven't done, but from the underlying illness that is shortening their life. And of course what the other side will do is say, oh, we're doing it anyway. Well, that's our argument. Secondly, proportionate pain and symptom treatment when the intention is not to kill but to care. So this is what we call double effect. And if someone has pain and you're titrating morphine or some other powerful painkiller against that pain, then what normally happens is that you will relieve the pain and the patient will live longer because they're in much less distress. And it's virtually always possible. Some palliative people would say it's always possible to relieve the pain without killing the patient because the therapeutic dose is less than the toxic dose. But the principle of double effect says that even if the patient's life is shortened as a result of painkiller that you're giving to relieve pain, then because your intention was to relieve the pain, not to kill the patient, that is the principle of double effect. That's perfectly legal in this country. So, do you see there's a huge difference between, on the one hand, giving morphine with the intention of relieving pain with the foreknowledge that it may possibly in some cases shorten life. There's a huge difference between that, which is entirely legal and ethical, and on the other hand doing what Shipman did or what happened in Gosport, where people with minimal pain or without pain at all were given morphine with a specific intention of ending their lives. And then finally, if a competent patient refuses medical treatment and they die from their underlying condition, then that's not euthanasia. So we need to be clear about what it's not. Now, I mentioned before, and we looked at this, the point being of this slide is that different arguments convince different people, but in combination, when people hear the best arguments against it, then the number supporting assisted suicide will drop from the 70s to the 40%. And we should take real heart from that, because even though there are some people who will never convince, there are a lot who, when they hear the arguments, will change their minds on the matter. So let's look at the four main arguments. And I've said this so many times already today, but when you hear our media interviews, you'll hear this or a version of it coming out again and again, because it just works. It works well. So a change in the law places pressure on vulnerable people to end their lives for fear of being a burden. It might be a financial burden, an emotional burden, a care burden upon others, and those at risk, particularly our disabled, elderly, sick or depressed people. And the thing about pressure is it applies not just to the patient, but also the relative. So just as there are vulnerable patients, also there are vulnerable relatives. And people who are determined to end their lives can put an extraordinary amount of pressure on loved ones to help them do it. And so if you have a law making assisted suicide or euthanasia illegal, it's protecting not only the vulnerable patient, but also the other people in the family. You know, if you really love me, you'll help me do this. Oh, but Mum, I can't, because you wouldn't want me to go to prison, would you? You see. So once that is removed, then that pressure can be overwhelming within families. And we picked up this language from the original House of Lords report back in 1994 from Lord Walton, who was medically qualified himself and chaired that committee. And these are the words: "We were concerned that vulnerable people would feel pressure, whether real or imagined, to request early death." So it's recognising that often it's this internalised sense of duty. Nothing will be said. In fact, it might be that the problem is nothing that's said, so that the vulnerable person will say, "Oh, you know, you wouldn't want me to go." And what they're really looking for is, "Oh, but Mum, you know, we're here with you right to the end." And of course, when nothing comes back, or, "Well, Mum, you know, if it's what you really want," then of course, yeah. So what's the reality of this pressure? Well, 70% of elder abuse occurs in families, so we can't assume that all families are good, and a significant proportion of it is financial, so there's something to be gained, perhaps to speed an inheritance, or so on, indebted relatives. 30 to 50% of lifetime healthcare occurs in the last 6 months of life, so there you are, there's a very quick way of saving money, or the relative costs. We talked about it being a healthcare option, and that's what happens when you legalise it, is there's an obligation then to provide it. We've looked at Barbara Wagner already. And this was the case I mentioned just a little while ago. This, you can see the date, 2nd of October, so this has only just happened last month. Australian man convicted of encouraging wife's suicide, and he counselled and aided her to take her life, and it was because of an inheritance. And in fact, it was on the news, it was on the top story in the BBC just 2 days ago, that he's now been sentenced as well. So it does happen that there are things in families. So that's the first argument. The second one is that incremental extension is inevitable. In other words, you cannot control these laws. And the primary reason for that is a logical reason. If you think the arguments that are used to justify euthanasia or assisted suicide are autonomy and compassion, but those apply very, very widely. And so there's a logical disconnect between, on the one hand, Dignity in Dying saying we need the law to change for reasons of compassion and autonomy, but we only want it to be for mentally competent adults with 6 months or less to live. Do you see the fundamental problem with that? And DID, of course, know this because their ambitions are much bigger than that, but they know that once they establish the principle, they can crank it up, because all you have to do then is bring someone along who's got 9 months to live but is suffering unbearably, and you say it's not fair, the law discriminates against them because these other people have a right that they don't have. Or you can bring along someone who's mentally incompetent and you say it's not fair because this is what she would have wanted, but she can't have it because it's only for mentally competent people. So the point is, once you establish the right for anyone at all, then you're inviting challenges under equality legislation. And the other side know that, which is why they're just trying to get the door open a little bit. Now in Canada, they have an even bigger problem than us, because they have a law called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which essentially says that a right that's given to one person has to be given to everybody. So you can imagine that's why Canada is in such a mess. So we see this, what I've called logical mission creep, using equality law. And we tend to use the words mission creep or incremental extension rather than slippery slope. And the reason for that is because slippery slope describes a passive process. But we have to recognise that the reason the law is changing is because people are pushing the envelope deliberately. And it was actually at a conference in the US and I was speaking, and I'd mentioned slippery slope, and one of the leaders of Not Dead Yet US came up to me afterwards and said, please don't use the word slippery slope. We always talk about incremental extension because it's a deliberate attempt to push the envelope. And I think he's absolutely right in that, which is why we changed our language about it. So we see this increase in numbers, spread to new categories, and perhaps, as you saw already in other jurisdictions, but also a change in the public conscience, so that things that triggered in one generation no longer do in the next one. Now, safeguards. The problem is that safeguards aren't safe, and no one's been able to produce a set of proposed safeguards that have convinced even the Parliament in Britain that they are safe. And you just think about these: terminally ill or 6 months left to live. Well, we all know that doctors, that there's a huge range of variation of how long people live with specific conditions, and doctors are notoriously bad at prognosticating how long they will live. There's been some very famous examples. I think of the Lockerbie bombers, who were released because they had, 6 months left to live, and then several years later they were enjoying the high life in the north of Africa. Ronnie Biggs, I think, was another one, the great train robber. Mentally competent, very difficult to assess, not in the hands of specialists. Adult, what age is that? 18 is in Westminster in the Maris Bill, 16 is in the Harvey Bill in Scotland. Or what about people who are so-called Gillick competent? So people are allowed to get contraceptives younger than 16, aren't they? So, and this is exactly the process that we've seen in Belgium and in the Netherlands, where they've said, well, look, this person's only 14, but they really do understand the implications of this decision and they should be treated like an adult. Issues about lethal drugs, where they'd be stored, witness statements, record keeping. We've alluded to the problems in Oregon already. So the point is, you cannot safeguard the laws, and that's been an argument which has been very convincing. There are the numbers. Belgium, I think the earlier histogram I showed you just went up to 2011, but you can see that's up to 2015, increasing, and we've looked at those figures already. But you didn't see the bottom line there, which was that if we had an Oregon-type law in Britain based on population projections, we'd be looking at about 1,200 British deaths per year with that kind of law. So, dangerous because of pressure on people. Incremental extension, it's impossible to control it. And the third reason is good palliative care is better. As we argued before, this is not your final argument because it's always trumped by autonomy. But this is Baroness Laura Finlay, who was Professor of Palliative Medicine in Cardiff and a member of the House of Lords, and who's been absolutely incredible on this issue, where she's campaigned for many, many years to stop the legalisation of assisted suicide in Britain. And she was right there at the beginning in helping us to set up Care Not Killing back in 2005. But this is her with her mum here, who's since died. And she says, "Mum wanted to die, but convincing her to live gave us both a life beyond measure." And because the reasons that most people want to end their lives are not due to physical symptoms, but having those around them who love them and will give them their lives meaning and purpose, that's why care is so important. And of course, palliative care is not just about physical symptoms, but addressing psychological and social and spiritual needs as well. So less than 10 in 20,000 dying patients have ongoing requests for assisted dying. This was a quote from Rob George, who was recently the chairman of the Association for Palliative Medicine in Britain. But he said, you know, I could count on my fingers the number of people I've looked after who had ongoing requests. In other words, not those who in a moment said, oh dear, I really want to go, but those who had persistent ongoing requests despite good care. And people will, in the main, change their minds once they experience the care that is involved. You can kill the pain without killing the patient, is the soundbite there. And we've looked at these figures already in Oregon. Should we be providing lethal injections for what are, in reality, spiritual problems? And then the final reason is that the current law actually works quite well by providing a deterrent because of the penalties it holds in reserve, because of discretion in sentencing and in prosecuting. The law has a stern face and a kind heart. Now, you may wonder who these people are and why they are there. But the chap at the bottom is Keir Starmer, who was the DPP, the Director of Public Prosecutions, when the Purdy criteria came into being. He's now a member of he's now an MP, and has shown his colours subsequently as being strongly in favour of changing the law to allow euthanasia. So that certainly explains some of the way he behaved around the Purdy case. But the chap at the top is named Stephen Marshall, and he comes from Hertfordshire, which is where I live, and he was the jigsaw murderer. So he was involved in a gruesome murder where they cut up the body and left the body parts in various parts of the county. And when he was convicted, he got, I think it was 35 years or something. So even though the murder law gives you a life sentence, of course you never get life, but he got 35 years. But on the other end of the spectrum, you might just get a discretionary sentence of 15 years if it's euthanasia. Or if it is assisted suicide, then it may well be less than that. So the other two people there are the Gilderdales, mother and daughter, and the daughter had ME. Her mother gave her, or helped her, self-administer an overdose of morphine to kill herself. And as the story goes, she lost consciousness but wasn't dead, and so the mother then stepped in and gave the whole syringe, and she died. Now, when it came to court, the issue was this assisted suicide or was it murder? Because it's the difference between the sentence, you see. Do you remember the differences in the two laws? And they couldn't prove that the final dose was what killed her, so they convicted her of assisting a suicide, but she got a 12-month conditional discharge, which meant she didn't go to prison at all, but was watched very closely after that. They didn't think that she would repeat it because the circumstances were quite special. But that's an illustration of the huge range of discretion there is in the British law. So Stephen Marshall on the one hand, 35 years, Kay Gilderdale on the other, doesn't go to prison at all. And our argument is that the law as it is at the moment actually keeps the numbers quite low. So you will get a trickle going to Switzerland. You can't stop them, but it's far fewer than we would have with an Oregon type law or with a Dutch type law in this country. These are just some of the sound bites. If you're talking to people about this, to friends or family or the school gate and so on, it's really good to be able to encapsulate an argument in a memorable sound bite. And these are some of the better ones, I think. The right to die can so easily become the duty to die. Or you can kill the pain without killing the patient. We need assisted living, not assisted dying. I heard this from a profoundly disabled woman with cerebral palsy who came to one of our meetings and was a campaigner against a change in the law. And it took her about 30 seconds to say these words because it was so difficult for her to speak. But it was one of the most powerful things I've ever heard on this subject. We need assisted living, not assisted dying. Hard cases make bad law. There's a whole CMF file, a paper on the back about that, arguing it from a legal perspective, or stern face and a kind heart. So just briefly, let me return to the Germany situation, because most people don't know about this, but Karl Brandt was the doctor who was known as Hitler's physician, and he carried out the first euthanasia case. It was a child who was blind and deaf and had limb abnormalities, and with the parents' consent, he gave a lethal injection to this little boy, and this was in 1939. That was the first case. He was one of the ones who was convicted and hanged at Nuremberg. So there's the 23. And the way the program worked, it began with children. So it was the child euthanasia program, first of all. And they set up a unit called T4, Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, where a number of paediatricians who didn't see the patients, but they just saw the charts that were sent, and they made a decision plus or minus. And there were 6,000 killed under the child euthanasia program, first of all. The next thing that happened was that they needed more hospital beds, and there were three main reasons for this. The war had started now. It was in the 1941. And first of all, there were Germans coming from abroad, from other countries, returning nationals who didn't have anywhere to live, so they needed places for them. They also had people who had been wounded and needed hospital care. They didn't have enough hospital beds. And there were also those whose homes had been destroyed and so needed accommodation. And so they calculated that they needed 70,000 beds. And so they simply went to the 6 largest geriatric and psychiatric hospitals in the country and counted them off, wrote to the relatives. If there was no due protest, then they were processed through the system. And initially they were killed with lethal injections, but then they discovered that wasn't quick enough and they couldn't deal with big numbers easily enough. So that's when Cyclone B began to be used, first of all, in hospitals. And then what happened after that is that they took the medical staff who'd been involved in these 2 programs and redeployed them to the camps, so that what happened in places like Auschwitz and Treblinka and Belsen actually had far more subtle and slower beginnings initially in psychiatric and geriatric hospitals all over the UK, all over Germany. And they redeployed the same staff, people whose consciences had been already numbed by being involved in the process and believed it was the right thing to do. So the 6 million Jews, of course, which is what we all know about, was actually a very late step in the whole story. That is the point, which is why Leo Alexander's quote about the early stages is so poignant. Anyone been to Auschwitz? Hands up. So, yeah. So, yeah, I've visited myself, and it's really important, I think. So there's the quote from Leo Alexander. Now, just a few chilling thoughts to finish on this. I think that the danger for West in the future is for 4 reasons. And the first one is the demographic time bomb. Now, I talked before about Japan. These are the age pyramids from Japan. That's 1950, so it looks like Nigeria does now. This is 2007, so just a few years ago, and then projected to 2050, and you see that the over 65 population has gone from 5% up to 39%, and the under 15 has gone from 35 down to 8%. But also see that the percentage of people in the 15 to 65 age group, so those who would be really supporting the economy, has reduced as well. So that's the demographic time bomb. Secondly, the international debt crisis, and of course, quantitative easing has helped to ease that and kick the can down the road and so on, but we now know that most of the countries in the world are in considerable degrees of debt, both public and private. There's the US. So whether it's Democrat or Republican, the debt just keeps on going up every year. The breakdown of Western society. So we all know about this, rising numbers of divorces, family breakdown, families living further away from each other, the growth of indebtedness and economic dependency. What does that mean? It simply means that there's less support available. And then we talked earlier on about the advance of atheism and its being wedded to secular humanist ethics. So we've got changing demography, growing debt, breakdown of family and community, and growing atheism. And I'd suggest to you that that is a rather perfect storm. And whilst the whole point of this day is that we can influence the way the future goes, and we've proved that in the UK, in the sense that the UK has not followed in the same direction as some other countries. But there is a sense of inevitability about this if things continue in the same direction that they are. And the pressure is indeed relentless, as we've seen.